Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Power of Co-Design. My name is Lisa Attygalle and I'm with the Tamarack Institute. I'm the Director of Community Engagement, so I lead the bulk of the work there. As we get started, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the land that we're joining from. I'm actually joining from Waterloo, Ontario, which is on the Holderman Tract and is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe and the Neutral peoples. As a settler here, I'm really grateful for the stewardship of the land that Indigenous peoples have cared for this land for so long. And I want to commit to the commitment of reconciliation and take an active stance for what that means and looks like in our work. So I invite you to share what the lands that you're joining from today as well. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce our speakers, Max Hardy and Anthony Boxshall. Welcome here today. We at Tamarack see you both as leaders in co-design, and so we're excited to have you here today to share your expertise and your experiences with us. So to start us off, why don't each of you share a little bit about yourselves and the work you do and how you came to work together? Max, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, it was very interesting. Had been just living in Melbourne for a year or so when I was approached by the EPA to help them out with an issue that they believed needed a co-design approach. And when I started working on it, they said, thanks for coming to help us. Can you please tell us what co-design is? We just know we need to do it. And in the course of that project, I've met Anthony, who was working in the EPA, and he was the person who kind of worked so hard to get some internal alignment and commitment to the process. And we worked on a very challenging project. And in the course of that project, we realized, I guess, the power of having someone working on the inside who was committed and who knew how to get some support, and as well as myself drawing on the experience of working with communities. So we learned a lot, and as a result of that, we've kept in touch. And then when Anth moved into consulting, we had an opportunity to do some work together to actually develop a co-design manual. So I'm going to flick to Anthony now just to talk a little bit about how this kind of led to what we're doing today, I guess.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, thanks. And good afternoon, everybody in North America, and good morning, everyone in Australia. I'm on Wurundjeri land. I should acknowledge the traditional owners of the Kulin Nation here where I am, which is where Max is as well. We're near each other physically.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, great intro. Yeah, it was a massively challenging project where we first met. And I've got to say, I'm a scientist by trade. So I'm not an engagement professional. So when you say leader, maybe not in the technical, in the conceptual, Lisa, but in the application, perhaps. I've always worked in decision-making, particularly decision-making at senior levels where you've got really complex challenges you're facing, really complex. I work at the board level and with senior leaders. My company, Science into Action, is about using science and complexity to make better decisions. And what that often means is you have to bring communities or other stakeholder groups to a place where they weren't, and you have to build trust. And so when we said we had this, as Max said, we had a very, very vulnerable community that had been, this is about 7 years ago, that had been impacted by something, by an incident, an environmental incident. And I thought, we've got to do something differently. We've lost trust. Engagement people said, oh, we got this guy, Max. And when I first met Max, I thought, whoa, what is this about? But he was right. He was spot on with what he said. So it kicked off I think, a great friendship and a great working relationship as well.
Wonderful. And so I guess for the people on this call today who might be new to co-design, let's just kind of ground in what it is before we get started so that everyone, we're all talking about the same thing. So from my understanding, co-design is a process to bring together diverse stakeholders with diverse perspectives to really work together to create something that meets their shared needs. What is it for you? And why don't you share a little bit more about the kinds of issues it's well suited for, and you know, the range of what the process could look like?
You want to kick off, Max?
I'll give it a go. Yeah, I
Let me
think
know
we
if you want me to show the slides too, Max, because if you want
yeah,
to work through that one later.
yeah, okay. Thanks. The thing about co-design is a lot of people are talking about it and throwing that term around. So when Anthony and I decided to put together a course and write a manual about it, we thought, what are we going to call this thing? And we sort of toyed with the idea of calling it fair dinkum co-design, to use an Australian term. But then we thought, no, we'll just go with authentic. So authentic co-design as a way of distinguishing it perhaps from other kinds of processes called co-design, but maybe for us didn't quite describe what we were sort of talking about. So I think you described it really well, Lisa. Co-design, I guess it's about, it's working on a solution together rather than, I guess, a conventional consultation approach, which is, you know, when you basically go out with a plan or a strategy and you ask for feedback or comment on it, or you try and, you know, maybe revise it somewhat through feedback. This is saying, you know, it may not necessarily be a blank canvas, but what we know is that we need people to be part of developing the solution, and we need to have the people who are affected by this issue and potentially by the solution to be at the table actually working on this. And the thing about co-design that I found incredibly powerful, and this example that we worked on was a great example of this, is that it wasn't just about saying to the community, or what do you think the solution should be? We had them interacting and working with stakeholders, working with scientists, working together to kind of figure out, you know, how we can resolve something that was quite challenging and difficult. So I guess the power of it is not just that you are helping to devise a solution, but the process itself builds trust and also means that your solution is more implementable because people have been part of the journey of how you get there. And so for us, that's kind of some really key features. So we like to talk about important principles, I guess, that relate to it. So I guess now we can sort of put up those slides.
Yeah, no, I will. And I just want to, can I build on one thing, Max? I think the super important piece for me is that you get delivery. So you just get the thing, whatever it is that you want, but then you get this, as Max was saying, this kind of trust, which from the perspective of any organization that wants to build something, anything at all, physical or ongoing and cultural or whatever it might be, you get an enduring basis on which you can work together in the future. And that, I think, is the critical piece. It's like, sure, you get the bridge, but you also get people who actually want to work with you and trust you. Yeah, I'll share this screen, Max, and let you run through kind of all those elements of it. Now, you're going to have to tell me when to click, I think.
Oh, that's all right.
Click
So
all these on?
yeah, so you can just sort of start clicking madly through those if you like to bring it up. This one of the things about co-design is that we don't believe there's any one formula or way to do it necessarily. That part of the co-design process is also co-designing how you're going to work together. So for us, when we were working in a community that was affected by this, it was a fire in a mine that burnt for a long time. How long was it?
45 days.
45 days. So
with a vulnerable community of about 7,000 people next door, where the smoke just went up and straight onto them.
Yeah, so there was a lot of health issues, as well as so a lot of damaged people, but a lot of anger towards government and frustration at the slowness or the perceived slowness of government to act and respond, which was major. But one of the things that we did along the way is we didn't sort of have the expert design the process. We actually started designing the process with people who are affected and interested in this. So we worked with other government agencies, community groups, people who are already influential in the community, who were really, really mad. And we sat down and said, well, what would we like to actually work on what we do about this? And our process was about designing an air monitoring network. And usually government would sort of come up with the way to do that and then explain it and get some feedback. We said, no, some money was allocated to design that network that was secured. And then we went to the community to say, well, we want to kind of figure out how to spend this money well and to build trust and confidence. And we invited people to work with us to come up with that network. What was important about the process is that we were able to sort of work out a number of things together about how we would do it. And these variables here is simply a way of, I guess, of acknowledging that you can do engagement in different ways and co-design in different ways. So when we look at these variables, say a lot of people are familiar with the IAP2 spectrum, it's important to actually design what level of influence here. And of course, in this case, it was very much a collaborative effort, and even to the point of this process itself was empowering actual decision making. And that was a challenge for government, and it was scary, wasn't it, Ed? That whole thing about and so this is something that hadn't been done before. That that the idea of actually allowing this process itself to determine how government would spend its money. So that was scary. But at the same time, we argued that that would be the least risky way of both getting an enduring solution as well as to build trust so there could be an ongoing relationship. And some of the other variables here, the composition, I love, you can see on that continuum, sometimes you can randomly select people to co-design. Sometimes there are expressions of interest. Sometimes you invite experts come in to do co-design, or you have decision makers, or a blended approach. In this case, we decided we needed people who were everyday people who were affected by this, but as well as people who were your hyper engaged, your influential, vocal, articulate community leaders, as well as having public servants involved and scientists. And so it was very much a blended approach that we went for in this case. And in terms of, the duration, it went for 3 days in terms of people working together, or it was actually 3 fairly long evening sessions that people worked together. But of course, the process itself went for months as far as designing the process and building confidence in it. The scheduling, yes, was spread out over evenings. The size, we had roughly, probably in the middle there, between 25 and I'd say 35 involved.
In that one.
Transparency, it was kind of a closed session in a way, but we did actually invite some people who were very interested to come and observe the process.
And even some local journalists asked if they could be in the room, and we said, absolutely. You can report on what you kind of see and hear, but you can't quote people, because we've got people making statements in the room. So it was very open in that sense. And because the broader engagement link is really important. I mean, this was a relatively small number of people, but there had been a lot of broader engagement work undertaken beforehand, a lot of conversations in designing the process. And what we learned from that fed into the co-design process itself when we're looking at co-designing a solution. So I guess the purpose of showing these variables is just saying, there are a number of things you need to work out, I guess, when you're planning it. And it's good to work that out with the people who are going to be part of the process, so that you're actually building trust. They're already starting to influence something. They're influencing the process itself by which we're going to co-design. So I know it sounds a bit wordy, but we were co-designing the co-design process. It's kind of meta, isn't it? But it's actually important.
And interestingly, while that was happening, there were so many conversations on the inside of government while we were doing this work to get support for it, because again, there was a fairly fuzzy idea about what does co-design actually mean and look like. And to some extent, we were, building the aeroplane as we were flying it. Would be a fair way to say
We can say that now, Max, can't we?
We can say it now, yes.
At the time, though, we knew exactly what we were doing because we wanted to give everyone surety that it was all going to be fine.
Yeah.
It is a funny one, though, Lisa, but that idea of building that trust in decision-making and where you use it. And there's as Max has highlighted, there's a couple of essential elements that we would talk about. The need for people, the need for having the people involved, and that people thing extends right from the communities that we're talking about there, and we'll talk about some other examples that we've both individually and collectively worked on, right through to the people who are in decision-making positions as well, and the importance of what their understanding is, of what their buy-in is, etc. And I think that the judgment thing is actually really critical, because you've got people who, no matter whether they work for a corporation or a government or a community-run agency, are going to enable someone else to be involved in a decision-making process. So they have to feel like they can, I'm going to say it, cede some power. They have to feel like they can actually let go of part of their decision-making power that they have. And everybody, approaches that differently. Everybody has a different way of dealing with that. And so, but what is critical is, no matter how they approach that, is that they exercise judgment, because there's no clear way of actually, there's not a standard operating procedure. As much as we've done a course and written a manual, the whole thing is based on the notion of asking yourself a series of questions at every step that change over as you get through the process of authentic co-design. And you've got to use your judgment. And Max and I, when we actually develop, and we'll talk about the principles in a tick, they're the third other piece. When we design what we'll talk through now with the principles and the framework, we actually co-designed it with a group of senior decision makers in the federal sphere. This is a totally different thing now, a couple of years back, 2 or 3 years back now, where there was a different kind of impact into communities, very culturally diverse communities, very geographically spread communities, all facing a particular impact. And I won't talk about what that is, just out of respect for the agencies involved. One of the lead agencies was an agency that was very used to a command and control type structure, and very used to making very fast decisions and solving problems quickly. And they are very skilled at what they do. They are very, very skilled at what they do. And they were confronted by an impact that they inadvertently had been having into the community. And now they were faced with what to do. And so they did what they did best, which was to rush in and fix everything. And the community said, hey, hang on, you caused this. Why are we going to trust you? So they came to us and we were talking about how we could do this. And we co-designed what Max and I'll talk through in the next couple of minutes with them, the principles and the framework. And this judgment piece came out of a conversation at the start and said, excellent, we've heard about this co-design stuff. We've read about it. Sounds very interesting. Can you give us a standard operating procedure for co-design? And Max and I kind of, we smiled and kind of went, oh, yes, of course we can, knowing full well that you can't, because you have to exercise judgment. So what we produced was the Authentic Co-Design Framework with a series of judgment-based questions and the principles. And Max, do you want to, let's run through the principles? Do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think one of the important principles that we, and I think this lends itself or responds to your question, Lisa, about when is it appropriate. And it's important that what people are co-designing is actually something substantial. If people are invited to invest time and effort into co-designing something, it needs to be worth the effort. It needs to be significantly shape something. So the substantiality part of it is not just from the point of view of the agency or sponsoring organisation. It needs to be substantial as far as participants are concerned. And if it's not, then chances are it's not that authentic. So one of our rules of thumb here is it's going to be more likely to meet this principle if the agency is somewhat uncomfortable about it.
Yeah, just a little.
Just a little bit, at least a little. But if they actually feels really cozy and comfortable and cool about it, chances are there's not much on the table that people can actually influence and shape and co-design. So it needs to be substantial. So that's the first principle, which is an important one.
There's a lovely little story about that too. Remember, Max, we neither of us are involved in this, but we did hear about this. And again, out of respect of the organisations, won't name them, but a large road construction group somewhere with a very large coastal road, which we won't name, a few years back was involved with a local community where there'd been quite a bit of slippage. If anyone knows the coast of California, it's a bit like that Big Sur coast, beautiful, beautiful high cliffs. And they were coming in saying, look, we're going to have to do something in the road here. And the community said, great, we'd love to be involved in that. And they said, yes, great, we'll get back to you. So they did what they did, as the engineers sometimes do, and came back with a decision that they could involve the community in, which was, what colour should we make the retaining wall? The community quite rightly said, nah, that's not what we wanted to discuss. We want to discuss in the access points, and, you know, they want to discuss a whole lot of things. It'd be safe to say it didn't go down too well. That was not substantial.
That
The reverse is something else.
Yes, it didn't quite cut the mustard with that one. So, and
Sorry,
I think that no, that's good. It's great. It's a great story. And I think one of the conversations we find ourselves having um, with people who kind of have carriage of various projects is, you know, the business case for doing co-design, which might feel risky and different. It could be the best money that is ever spent, because for projects like that, and we're talking about a range of different sectors, it is enormously expensive for government. When you have a project that takes 2 or 3 times as long to implement, and then at the same time you're burning trust, the amount of time and money spent in that, it is enormous. So there is what we see, though it's uncomfortable, it's the least risky and probably the least expensive path that people can take, is to invest in a co-design process involving people in being part of the solution. So the second principle we talk about is being collaborative, inclusive, and safe. And, you know, I think it's recognizing that you need diversity, so it needs to be inclusive, and you need to have people who have points of view that are inconvenient to those who are the ones maybe who have responsibility for the project. So you need diversity, you need cultural diversity, you need to have people who are affected in different ways, who are seeing different things, which kind of links to the next principle that Anth will talk about. So there's learning from each other. The collaboration, I guess, is about, we are creating something. So collaboration for us literally means we are working together to actually do something new, to do something different. And the safety part is really important. So in some situations, it is not so safe for people to participate. They're concerned about their reputations. They're concerned maybe about leaving their tribe that has a particular point of view about what the solution should be. And so there's a whole lot of ways about what it means to be safe, and also safety for public servants or experts. How do we make it safe for them to participate so that they feel like their reputation is going to be intact by being part of it? There's a lot of things about that whole safety, inclusivity, to make collaboration happen. And we could talk about that for a full webinar in itself.
Because I was also thinking about cultural safety. There are times where there's been conversations that we've been involved in where it's been, you know, culturally inappropriate for certain people to be involved in certain ways. You know, it might be First Nations or it might be other things as well. So yeah, there's a lot in that one, isn't there, Max?
Sure. And so you can keep going on the mutual learning, I think.
Yeah. So the mutual learning one's really interesting because I being, as I said, a scientist, I get absolutely sick and tired of technical people saying, oh, we can't involve the community in that, or we can't involve those other stakeholders in that because we'll have to dumb it down or whatever. I just think, apart from it being, I think, disparaging, it's actually also not recognizing that there are different knowledge bases. And so when there are, just take a First Nations perspective, which I can't bring, but I have talked with people about. There are ways, particularly in Australia, where First Nations people look at the interactions that they have with different parts of, so the environment, very differently than the way an engineer would bring. And there's something about where the road might go, which actually can achieve both outcomes as long as you listen to that outcome. And so there's a lot of input that can come from the community, and then there's also a lot of input. This is why it's mutual learning, because there is a sense of enabling, particularly with technical, complex, deep technical information like climate adaptation information, health information, other scientific information, environmental impacts, et cetera. There is a way of bringing that information in to share that with a group in a way that enables people to kind of go, right, now I get at least the basics of it. I'm not going to run a PhD on it, but at least I can describe it to my grandma when I see her. And that's the kind of stuff. And so quick example, this was something that was involved in an environmental impact perspective, where the scientists had found something and they couldn't quite work out what the contamination was. They could not work out where it was coming from. And they opened up the question to the community and said, well, we know where this source is, with this source, and sat that down in front of the community. And someone, some old farmer said, oh, yeah, there used to be a paint factory up the road of whatever there, near that town years ago, when we're all riding horses, whatever. But it wasn't on the map, it was something that was just, it wasn't in the council records. And so they were, oh, well, that's where that's coming from, And so there was just, even at that level, kind of really insightful information that you can get out of fostering mutual learning.
I don't think there's ever been a project where people haven't learned something new from an unexpected source. And I think that the openness and transparency, you can see how this sort of links to it. It's being open about what you know, which is trust building, and also being open about what you don't know, as well as being transparent about what is being done with the input that we're getting. So it's a fairly straightforward one, but again, for government, there's discomfort about being too open. What if we share this information, and what if all hell breaks loose? Because people sort of go crazy with this information. And yet, in terms of building trust, that is kind of a key thing. Let's actually open the books, come and have a look at what's going on. And that's just incredibly important, I think, for building relationships and also feeding into what people are learning from each other. So I think that it's recognizing that there's different kinds of expertise we want to tap into and make open. And let's see how much we can learn from each other by being open, that actually positions us in a way that we can actually do some work in kind of looking at what we can do about it. The last principle is, I'm going to flick back to Ants for this one, about it's kind of one that maybe, it's certainly the biggest word we've got in our principles, being jurisdictionally aware. And what is that about?
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? This, as we said earlier, Lisa, this whole kind of authentic co-design principles approach, and then the framework we'll show next, grew out of the co-design with a series of agencies. And the thing that everybody in any decision-making position knows is that there is regulatory oversight of everything you do by multiple regulators. Now, whether that be at a local government level, at a state or provincial government level, at a federal government level, or whether it be health regulators or environment regulators or IT, cybersecurity regulators, or whatever it might be, there always is. And you almost now can't do anything anywhere without there being some jurisdictional overlap of something. And so this really interesting one was, the agencies kept circling back. We have to involve them. And we suddenly realized at a principal level, you need to make sure that you have everybody who has skin in the game. Now that means it could be local communities that have tribal relationships with a particular area, as well as migrant communities that have moved in that have built a deep cultural base as well. Those are jurisdictional in a sense. And so just that, having anybody who's got any formal skin in the game involved is really critical in some way.
And one of the things I think is important about that, sorry to cut in there, is that it's one of the blockers that stops government from saying we're committed to co-design, because they're going to come up with something crazy that we can't implement. And so, well, what we need to do is build into the parameters of the process, the legislative, the jurisdictional stuff that we need to be aware of and to work within, so that that's not on the table. There's some stuff we can't come up with something which actually doesn't honor or acknowledge some, environmental law or whatever it is, that needs to be factored in to be part of the process.
And it could be the tiniest thing that could flip something, trip something up too. Say, for example, they're building a network of something, as Max talked about earlier, air monitoring network. Let's take that one. Getting a community to co-design that. At one point, it became clear that wherever those things go requires industrial phase power. And that required the local government instrumentality to make sure that it had the power to that part of the regional area. And so, little tiny things that are just so critically important can come out of that. One of the things that then we're working with that cohort was, okay, so you take these principles, you use your judgment, you got the people, there's 5 principles. We've embedded this into the 6 steps. And this is our, I'm not going to say pretend because that would be too strong a word, but this is how it becomes a standard operating procedure. 6 steps, 6 simple steps. And the critical one, we won't talk through each one of them because this is in the course, it's in the manual. But step 1, the really critical one, is checking that you're ready to collaborate. And this, the thing that I've learned so much from Max about is, it's almost like, if you can't do this, if you're not ready, if you're the person who needs to be making the decision and seating the power, if your organization is not understanding what it's jumping into, don't. There's lots of other engagement tools you can use. But if you are, then co-design is a great way to achieve the various outcomes. And then you kind of, you build an understanding, you decide what you're going to do together, you co-design what you're doing, you implement it, and of course you review it. And the whole thing is a kind of virtuous cycle in a big figure of 8 on its side, with no reason why it's on its side, it just is. And it just, that critical first one, Max, isn't it? That readiness to do it is crucial.
There's so many different elements about being ready, of course, and that's quite a process to get there. So it's kind of like it's a process within a process, is getting the readiness. I think the thing about this, it sort of looks vaguely like a plan, do, check, act type cycle that people are familiar with.
Yeah.
Part of the reason we did the figure 8 is that we know sometimes you have to circle back before you can go further. So in deciding, say, going from step 3 to step 4 looks good, but sometimes there's something happens. There might be a new stakeholder. There might be some new awareness that there's some other jurisdiction you need to be aware of, and we need to check back and need to get ready again, and we need to build a relationship, and we need to start working out. So it's just a way of actually just acknowledging that sometimes it might look like you're going backwards before you go forwards. What you're doing is you're still moving towards building the trust and the foundations you need to co-design effectively. So getting back to Lisa's question, I noticed that there was a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions. Well, I think we will stop soon and start responding to some of the questions. And I noticed one from my friend Anne Brooks in Alaska, unless it's another Anne Brooks, in which case I apologise to you, about this could be a cool process for addressing, homelessness, for instance. And a very current project that Anne and I are working on, and it's just a sort of, I think, shows how the process can be applied to different sectors. We've been invited to help a health organisation to build trust and build connections with people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness or vulnerable communities in all sorts of ways, to become ready for the COVID vaccine because they're seen as being a risk of not being vaccinated, and therefore potentially becoming future super spreaders and so on. But they also want to actually build relationships so they can offer other health services into that community that generally or often does not trust government or services. So instead of them thinking, well, let's just design the program and roll it out, it's recognizing the people that they're trying to engage with are the most important asset here. We need to combine the knowledge of, public health people. That's a kind of expertise we have to tap into, obviously, about the science of it. But we also have to tap into the expertise and relationships in those communities and their networks, because they're the people who know best how to get the message across and build trust about this. We need to actually design the strategy with those people and with other people in the system. So this is very current and very new for government, and we're starting to work on that. And I think that it just goes to show that there are infrastructure, planning, environmental issues, social issues, health, are all. So I think if provided something is sufficiently tricky, complex to resolve, potentially very expensive, controversial, all those sorts of things.
With one extra addition, Max, has a doable element. Like there's a really doable, achievable task in it. So you probably couldn't tackle the whole societal challenge of X, Y, or Z, but you could go, right, in this location, how are we going to do this? Or how do we build that practice there that we can then learn from and apply in other places?
So one of the terms we use quite a lot is we need to start working with our community as an asset. How do we tap into the assets that they have and respect that and invite that and into the process, because you kind of need that, because you're not going to make much progress unless they're part of the solution, and you're not going to come up with really as good a plan. I think that's, you're not just doing it to be nice, just so you can get through it and get it done. No, you're actively wanting to connect and tap into that expertise, because that is a critical piece to coming up with a doable solution. So that's our little framework. So that's probably enough of that. We could sort of go on to tackle the questions. I hope they're not too hard. The really hard ones, Ants can try and answer.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
What do you want us to do, Lisa?
Well, I just thank you for the description of the process. I think something that is resonating a lot for me, and I really enjoyed, Anthony, whenever you would chuckle about the process, you know, because it oftentimes, you know, maybe people in formal positions of power, you know, want those answers or want that clear process. And what you're saying is, to have an authentic co-design process, what we need to do is focus on those principles, focus on who we're engaging, how we're engaging, and not specifically what the outcomes are in advance, because those aren't knowable right now. And so for an authentic process, we really need to focus on the how of the engagement. And I think that's really powerful. So thank you. I just have one more question before we jump to the questions that have been submitted. Can you tell us when not to use co-design? You know, I don't want to, it's such a powerful process, you know, and as you've been speaking, I've been, and, you know, a lot of the processes that I've facilitated, they've always just, you know, that sense of alignment at the end, the power of the process is really big, but I don't want to necessarily, you know, oversell it or say that it's the right tool for every situation. So when should you not use co-design?
Few situations, I think. One is if it's not sufficiently tricky, and it is relatively straightforward, although some projects are technically straightforward, but socially they're very hard to implement, which is a level of complexity. But some projects, if they don't have a sufficient level of complexity, I don't think people will buy into it with the same level of energy. So that's one thing. The other situation is, again, going back to the readiness, I wouldn't say you don't jump into co-design if you don't have decision makers or sponsoring organisations who are really willing to jump into it and they're genuinely open to this being influential. Because I think you don't want to go into it to put so much work into something and have it fall flat. That just does a lot more damage. It just destroys more trust, and there's a legacy that it takes a long time to recover from. And that has been the experience of people for even doing basic forms of community engagement. They feel ripped off and it hasn't been worth their time and effort. So I think there's some of the situations. If it's straightforward, not sufficiently complex, there isn't a genuine commitment to it, I'd say I wouldn't attempt to do co-design.
Yeah, just to build on that second one, I totally agree on the over-engineered thing. If you don't need it, don't use it. But then, I'd take it further that if you did attempt to do a co-design and you didn't have the foundational leadership pieces in place, whatever it is, a corporation, a local group, a community leadership, if you didn't have that decision maker or makers who were willing to give some of their power, their decision-making power to others, you'll actually do more harm than good by trying to do what you call co-design and not doing it. Because we have a saying over here, and apologies, I don't know whether I can swear, but you know, like most people in the community have really good bullshit detectors. That's a very Australian saying. Sorry for that, if North Americans are offended by that. And those detectors work really well. And so if you walk into those circumstances and they sniff the lack of any insincerity about this, and a good test is to go back to those principles, is it substantial, blah, 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 then they're just going to go, nah, this is not real. I would never, ever do that. And it takes a lot of work to build what we call a stickable mandate inside the organization to last through the process, because sometimes these things can take months
Mhm.
or longer.
Yes.
Thank you for
Indeed.
that. Duncan, yeah, I think we should turn to the questions, and you've been keeping your eye on the votes. So why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and thank you both. Yeah, the most questions I think I've ever seen in one of these webinars, so it's a really engaged audience today.
We're
Thanks,
posting
everyone.
most of them ourselves under
Oh,
different
that, yeah.
names, just so you know. Yeah.
It's all those aliases.
Yeah.
First
Oh, I
question,
love some of these questions.
yeah, they're good. First is from Alexis, and they ask, how do you get people to the table? Folks who are traditionally underrepresented or disengaged, how do you get them interested and involve them in the process?
Yeah, wow. It's big, isn't it? I think I don't think there's any easy answer. I think that there's a few things that I've learned that I've found to be helpful. One is going to where they are on their turf, where they feel safe. It's also identifying people that they trust and that they do have a relationship with, and building a relationship with them and looking for ways to make it safe for people to contribute. I think there's also some ways to cut through and do something different by a very personal invitation to saying, we need your help in a process. So with random selection, sometimes approaching people, it might be random, might be you're identifying people who you believe could be a really important part of creating or being part of the co-design process. But a very nice invitation to them, because often when people are engaged, it's like, we have a project, here's an issue, come and have your say. It sort of sets a very different tone to what we're talking about, which is, here's an invitation. We need people with your lived experience or your perspective at the table, because government keeps getting it wrong. We can't afford to get this wrong. It's too important. Would you please come and participate in this process and help us work out a solution together? Now, there may be very low trust. There might be a concern about people not being capable. So there is a whole process of having conversations, of reassuring people. In the case of these times of COVID, giving people practice sessions, participating in a Zoom call, for instance. There's a whole lot of capacity building elements to it. Apologies for the motorbike. So I don't think there's it'd be sort of not genuine on my part to say that it's an easy process to get people to the table. And sometimes people are not ready to come to the table yet. So it's finding who are the people that they might trust. If they're not going to participate, who for them would they like to see at the table, so they believe their interests are being represented and that their knowledge and perspective is being taken on board. And that's another way, I guess, of building trust in it.
I'll just add two thoughts to that too, just building on that. One is the key messengers. And so that personal invitation may not actually be, it may not be perceived to be useful from the government or the corporation, whatever it might be, but knowing who that group listens to and helping and getting and working with them to issue that invitation can be important. So the key messengers, and then also the motivation. So often, if it depends what the motivation is, if the motivation for the need for the solution and the co-design is there's been a crisis, then often sometimes that breaks down some of those challenges that people have about wanting to turn up, because they go, no, I want to help, I want to be involved in this. If it is kind of, for want of a better term, business as usual need for discussion or whatever it might be, that's when you might need to look at a lot of those issues that Max was just talking about as well.
And one additional thought for that kind of recruiting piece, I think if you want the representatives of that co-design team to be representative of the community, having the community nominate who they want to represent them is another approach that we found really effective. So, reaching out to a group and say, who do you want to represent your network on this team? And also inviting them to commit to the feedback loops, between sessions to share back what's happening and bring additional perspectives into that. And I documented a process that I facilitated recently in that recruitment, and I'll just put a link to it in the chat for your reading.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Lisa.
And
it's interesting.
You go. Sorry, Max.
I was just going to say that one of the things about building trust in the process is when you see that people are willing to sign up to it, makes it safer for other people then to say, yeah, I'm prepared to be involved if they're going to be involved. So it's about being strategic. So a term that we've come across lately thanks to Scott Miller, who I know is participating. And Scott, you might want to put a link into the chat yourself about your nice piece that you wrote recently about spark plugs. You need internal spark plugs. You need spark plugs in the community to tap into the right people to start firing the process. So it's a really interesting piece as well. So I think while we're sharing resources, Scott, that might be a good one for you to put in too about spark plugs. I think you can't collaborate with everybody all the time, can you? But you can be strategic about those, the significant either thought leaders or influencers in the community who can actually build confidence in the process. So, yeah.
And I love that what you were saying, Lisa, about essentially just ask. and in particular, and thanks to the note, was it Janet, I think, in the chat? Yeah, in Australia, we talk about First Nations as a collective, and I note that in Canada it is different. There are different terms used for different nations and peoples. And so, but thank you for that. So, but in Australia, working with First Nations, working with Indigenous Australians, that is simply the most important thing. For example, with that community is just say, well, just ask us. We'll tell you. Don't assume. Just ask. And you kind of go, how incredibly simple is that? And yet is not done. Anyway, that is a whole other seminar, that one.
Yeah. So
are you voting up your own questions, Scott? Is that what's happening here, Scott?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I copied and pasted the link that Scott provided to the panelists here, just to the whole group. So I encourage you to check that out. Our next question is from Scott. And they ask, how do you onboard new players to something already partially designed by the community? Seems there might be some unhappy with not being involved right from the start.
This is your thing, Max, about the circularity of the process.
Yeah, that's right. Very much so. What do you do? I mean, you want to respect the work that's been put in, and you don't want to say, let's start all the way back at the beginning. So I think it's always that sense of let's still keep build on what we've done, but hey, we've got someone new who might have something new to bring. So I guess it's about providing opportunity to review what's been done and how we've got there, and looking for opportunities for this new piece of information or perspective to how it can enrich what's already been done. So I think it's about building on rather than sort of starting back all over again. So I think it's about, you want to respect the fact that someone might feel a bit aggrieved that they've been left out. That's okay. With the best of intentions, we started work. Let's also respect what people have already started to build and work on and understand how we got there. So I don't know there's any easy way of doing it, but for me, it's that principle. Let's just acknowledge people matter here. Let's exercise that judgment about how far do we need to go back? Do we need to undo what's been done, or can we just tinker and build on? So it's a judgment call, isn't it?
And I think just building on that judgment stuff too, Max, this is where it's a really crucial element where co-design is not always democracy. We're trying to work together to achieve an outcome. And if you believe that it's critical that this group be involved, then the question you may ask the group is not can they, but how do they join? And then you work on how do we onboard rather than do we onboard? Because if you need that cohort to be working together, and I've seen this work where we've had industry groups who don't talk to green groups, for example, or even better, two types of fisheries, two types of fishery groups that don't talk to each other. Recreational and commercial fisheries don't like each other. It's in some parts of this country. And so you don't have to say, would you like to be in the room if one of them's in already? You say, how do we get them in the room?
I think just naming the transparency required here. Yeah. So typically whenever anybody new is joining a process, it's because you've recognized a gap. And so being clear about, we started down this process, realized that we didn't have representative from this, or we uncovered an issue that we didn't have the expertise in the room to deal with that. So we've invited people in, we need you, we need your opinion. And so that honest recognition of gaps, to make the invitation and the validation of the perspectives that the newcomers bring.
Okay.
That's great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. The next is also from Scott, and they ask, doesn't power really just boomerang back to those who share it in the first place in co-design, maybe in the form of trust?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is one of the insights that It's an interesting conversation about power and authority and all that, it's uncomfortable for people to cede power. The reality is they're exercising power in a different way. They're not actually losing. They're not, and so part of the issue is I've got this position of responsibility. I'm one that has to make the decision, and my neck is on the line. And the jurisdiction says I'm responsible. Therefore, I can't let go. Actually, well, you can actually exercise power in a different way, and you are supporting a decision process that looks like this. In actually developing trust in the process, you're going to sort of arrive at something which is more implementable. And you're probably familiar with the book Covey Jr. about the speed of trust. That if you have trust, you can get things done more quickly and more cheaply. And if you don't have trust, it is expensive and it is slow, and it is absolutely true. So although it might seem risky and uncomfortable, yes, I think sharing power is a way of actually not having more power over people. What it does is gives you the power to implement a solution.
And it's really interesting. I always have to reframe my mind when Max says about exercising power in a different way, and it's because when I work with decision makers, you've got to cut through and say you've got to cede power. But it is actually exactly as Max describes. It's exercising it in a different way. Now, the other point that is really critical with this is it's actually really hard to get a metric of trust to give to people. And so what you end up doing is you end up gathering metrics of what distrust costs you. So it costs you financially in an organization, it costs you time-wise, it costs you grief-wise. If it's government, then you're answering all those letters to ministers and prime ministers and whatever it might be. It costs you in just the general hellishness of delays, all those kinds of things. And so what you
designing
end up
poor solutions.
Designing poor, exactly, yeah. Losing at the ballot box, if et cetera, et cetera. And so what we've found is the need to it's unfortunate, but you end up focusing on what you get if you don't get the trust. And there's a question further down from Alicia Brandenburg around how do you build it and maintain it? And I think it's a really critical point to build on here, because you do need to nurture it. You can't kind of go, you've invested all this effort, you've built this well, and then you go, yeah, okay, fine, now we'll just draw on that over time because it'll run down again. And so it is, I would argue, from an organizational cultural perspective, stepping into a genuine co-design project is actually a little bit of an organizational culture change. And so therefore your interactions, organizations that have done this well, often find that their future other different projects or whatever they are slightly different. Like it's a change in practice. And so, there are some, I would argue that these are tools of culture change as much as they are anything else. And then that ongoing process of maintaining that relationship with that community, you may have nothing else to co-design them with, but you could say to them, what else do you want to know about this particular thing or things like it? And they'll say, oh, well, no, we're fine. You just tell us later. You go, okay, fine. Or they may say, no, we want to know what color it is in the future. And go, okay, great. Every time color comes up, we'll go and ask you. And you've got to honor that into the future.
I think we have time to squeeze in one more quick question. And then I'd love for you to share a little bit about your course. So let's do a short answer for the next question.
Yeah, next question comes from Janet, and it's an important one. And they ask, how do you present the idea of design with accessibility in mind for people with disabilities to avoid pushback of too expensive or it takes too long?
It's interesting this question come up because I've just recently did a podcast with something called Real Democracy. I'll send the link through Tamarack later about this, about involving making processes accessible for people with disability, and it can be time consuming. I think what's critical about this is we're not just doing this to be nice and inclusive. We are doing it because we need this perspective at the table, because we don't have these people who have a lived experience of disability. And how are we going to design, if you like, a city that's really accessible for people and inclusive. How do we do that? We're doing it because we actually need their expertise, so you invest in it. So yes, things can take time, but it also takes time, and it's really expensive to do some stuff really wrong. And there's a bucket load of examples where poor design has happened, planning solutions, other examples where the failure to engage the people who perhaps are, you might need to invest more time in to have them to participate. You actually need them. And if you don't, it can be very, very expensive, and really, really dumb decisions are made. So we, years ago, I was involved in designing a citizens jury process for people with disabilities around our NDIS. And how could we actually determine the merit of the program, what needed to happen, unless we include people with lived experience of disability? It just doesn't make any sense at all. But how often do we see that we have public servants and other experts meeting in a room talking about designing something for people rather than with people? And I think this is just the power of doing with, not doing for.
Just very, drawing into the course now, one of the, in step 4.3, where you're actually building a co-design, panel, group, people. One of the things that we talk about is just looking at all the different axes of diversity that are required, and kind of, okay, Indigenous and women and men and, all these different, whatevers, and transgender and blah, 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 all these things come out. You need to make sure that you're aware of all of those elements. And fostering mutual learning means having all that diversity, listening to the diversity and the diversity of perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so as we wrap up, you have been wonderful in creating these principles and creating a framework for us. And so tell us about the course and the manual and that opportunity to get involved.
It's a self-guided course, and as you can see, there's so Susan Carter is our colleague, and basically we all did it in Melbourne. Had a very harsh lockdown, and we couldn't go out of our houses, so we filmed the entire thing in lockdown. As a self-guided thing, you could do it in half a day. If you wanted to. It comes with a 90-page guide, and it takes you through the what kind of things you need in place, the common challenges, the 5 design principles, what co-design is, when to use it, when not to use it, and then the 6 steps in order. And it's basically a conversation between us about how to use it. There are activities through it, there are worksheets. I think there's something like 10 or 12 worksheets. So you build up your own capability as you go through. And there's, I think, a deal with, there's like a Tamarack price, which is 10% less than anyone else in the world gets it as well. And so I think a link will go out.
Yeah, we'll send out a link to that, and the manual as well, as a way to guide. Yes. If you're looking to facilitate, so if you're looking to use co-design in your work, so very helpful to understand what is necessary in that process. So thank you so much for joining us. Duncan, why don't you share the last 2 opportunities for our crew today?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. The first is an online course from the Tamarack Institute, Foundations of Community Engagement. And it's, again, a learn at your own pace course with Lisa, where you can go through the process of building up the foundation of your community engagement work. It's about 5 to 10 hours of content that you work through at your own pace, along with monthly coaching calls with Lisa. And the second is our Community Engagement 2021 virtual workshop. We have 1 date left in February, where you can join Lisa and dive into what community engagement looks like in the current context. And as well, we do have a co-design workshop coming up over the month of May that we'll provide some more information about. And lastly, we host webinars like this every week, usually on Wednesday. And so we'll send a link to our upcoming webinar schedule so you can join us again. Thank you, Lisa, Anthony, and Max, for sharing your wisdom today. Really appreciate it.